All right, so uh, have you ever been hiking or driving, and looked up at a mountain or a mesa and thought, huh, that kind of looks like a giant tree stump?
Huh. Yeah, I could see that.
I mean, it sounds crazy, right? But there's this whole theory floating around suggesting that some of the mountains and rock formations we see today could actually be the remnant of massive ancient trees.
Yeah, I've heard about this. It's definitely an intriguing idea.
So today we're doing a deep dive into this theory, looking at the evidence and, yeah, seeing if it holds any water.
Sounds like fun. I'm game if you are.
Let's do it. Our source material for this is going to be this segment we found called Giant Ancient Tree Stumps. Now, keep in mind, it's presented as like a full-blown theory, right? But we're going to approach it with, a healthy dose of skepticism.
Right, skepticism is healthy. We should always question what we hear.
Absolutely. So with that said, let's start with the visual evidence presented in the source. And their prime example is Devil's Tower in Wyoming.
Devil's Tower. Okay, I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah, it's that massive isolated rock formation, and it kind of, well, if you squint a little, it resembles a tree stump.
I could see that.
Yeah.
And it's not just the overall shape either. Devil's Tower has these distinct hexagonal columns, almost like you'd see in a cross-section of tree trunk.
Right, exactly. And to really get a sense of the scale they're proposing here, think about those giant sequoia trees like General Sherman.
Oh, yeah, General Sherman. Incredible tree.
That tree is over 2,700 years old, and it towers over 275 feet tall. Now imagine a tree so massive that its stump would dwarf even General Sherman. It's mind-boggling.
That is pretty wild to think about.
And the source doesn't stop there. They go on to suggest that Devil's Tower isn't unique.
So there are other potential stumps out there.
That's what they claim. They point to mesas and mountains all over the world that share those visual characteristics.
So like a global pattern of giant tree stumps.
Yeah.
Interesting. What are some of the other locations they mentioned?
Well, they talk about the Giant's Causeway in Ireland.
Oh yeah, those interlocking basalt columns, pretty striking.
Right, and they also point to Bell Rock in Arizona.
Okay, steep sides, flat top. Yeah, I see the resemblance.
And it goes on. They mention similar formations in Russia, Ethiopia, Venezuela, Canada, Italy, Argentina, Australia, even Cape Town, and all over the U.S.
Wow. That's a lot of potential stumps. But hold on a sec. Even if we entertain this idea for a moment, wouldn't a tree that massive require like a completely different atmosphere and environment than what we have today? I mean, wouldn't it?
That's a good point, and the source addresses that. They suggest that the Earth before the biblical flood was much different potentially, with conditions that could support such gigantic trees.
Oh, okay, bringing in the flood narrative. Now that adds a whole other layer to this.
It does, but how does that tie into the hexagonal patterns we see in places like Devil's Tower and the Giant's Causeway?
That's where it gets really interesting. The source proposes that those hexagonal patterns are not just coincidence. They believe those patterns, which are also found in other seemingly unrelated geological formations, like the salt flats of Bolivia, are actually remnants of the cellular structure of these ancient trees.
Wait, so they're saying the patterns are like fossilized wood grain or something?
Precisely. They argue that the hexagonal patterns we see in these rock formations are remarkably similar to the cellular structure you'd find in a cross-section of a tree trunk.
Okay, I'm starting to see where they're going with this. But even if we entertain that idea for a moment, what about the sheer amount of material we're talking about here?
Right, it's a huge amount.
If these mountains are really just stumps, where did the rest of these giant trees go? I mean, that's a lot of wood.
That's another key aspect of the theory. The source suggests that these giant trees weren't just left to decompose naturally. They propose that these trees were actively cut down, mined, and even burned by some unknown force.
Whoa, hold on. Cut down. We're talking about trees of unimaginable size?
Mm-mm.
What kind of tools or technology could even handle that? I mean, seriously.
Yeah, that's a major point of contention. The source acknowledges the lack of evidence for tools or machinery on that scale, but argues that the sheer existence of these formations suggests a level of technology beyond our current comprehension.
Okay, so they're proposing a lost civilization with technology capable of felling trees the size of mountains.
It's a bold claim, for sure, and one that would require a ton of supporting evidence. But hey, it's that kind of out-of-the-box thinking that sometimes leads to groundbreaking discoveries.
All right, I'm definitely intrigued, but let's pump the brakes for just a second. If these trees were harvested and processed like they're suggesting, where did all that material go? We should see some evidence of it somewhere, shouldn't we?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
The source doesn't provide a clear answer to that. They speculate that some rock formations might be byproducts of that processing, but admit it's just a hypothesis. And that's where things get even more fascinating.
So we're left with a lot of unanswered questions. We've got these visually compelling formations, this theory about their origins, and a whole lot of speculation about what happened to the rest of these hypothetical giant trees. What's the next step in our deep dive?
Well, we'll look at the visual evidence and the source's interpretation of it. Now it's time to delve into the scientific arguments, both for and against this theory. Let's unpack what mainstream geology has to say about the formation of these structures and compare it to the claims made in the source material.
Right, let's do it. I'm really curious to see what kind of evidence would be needed to give this theory more weight.
Me too. This should be good.
Okay, so I
Wait,
think, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, it's time to bring in the science.
I was going to say the same thing. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty.
Let's do it.
All right. So how about we start with,
Go for it.
okay, so mainstream geology has
Yeah.
a very different explanation
Oh, yeah, definitely.
for how these formations came to be.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So are you ready to hear about
Hit me with it.
igneous intrusions?
Let's hear it. Okay, so let's dive into how mainstream geology explains these formations we've been discussing. You see, Devil's Tower, for example, is classified as an igneous intrusion. Igneous intrusion. Okay, break that down for me. What does that mean exactly?
Sure. So basically it means that molten rock or magma pushed its way up from deep within the Earth's crust and cooled into solid rock.
Ah, okay.
And in the case of Devil's Tower, the cooling process caused the rock to contract and fracture, which is what created those distinct hexagonal columns.
So instead of a massive tree trunk, mainstream science says it's basically a giant solidified blob of magma that cracked as it cooled.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And this process of igneous intrusion is responsible for many other similar formations around the world. The Giant's Causeway, with its iconic basalt columns, is another prime example.
Makes sense. But what about those hexagonal patterns that the source keeps highlighting? Does geology have an explanation for why those appear in seemingly unrelated formations like the salt flats?
It does. In the case of the salt flats, those patterns are a result of the way that salt crystals grow and interlock as water evaporates. So while they might look similar visually, the underlying processes are completely different from what the source is proposing.
So mainstream science offers a very different explanation for these formations than the giant tree theory. But does it completely debunk the idea? I mean, what kind of evidence would be needed to lend more credibility to the giant tree theory?
Well, for starters, we'd need to find fossilized remains of these massive trees. I mean, trees are organic. They leave behind traces like petrified wood or even fossilized leaves. If these mountains were truly tree stumps, we should be able to find those kinds of remnants somewhere, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. What about the tools or the technology that they propose were used to cut down these trees? Would finding something like that be like the smoking gun?
Absolutely. Finding tools or machinery of a scale capable of handling these hypothetical trees would be a major piece of evidence. It would revolutionize our understanding of ancient civilizations and their technological capabilities.
So, fossilized wood giant tools, anything else that might sway the scientific community.
Another compelling piece of evidence would be finding unusual compositions within these rock formations. If they were once living trees, they might contain organic compounds or trace elements that aren't typically found in igneous rocks.
So, there's a pretty high bar of evidence to meet.
Yeah.
But let's say, for the sake of argument, that we did find some of that evidence. What would the implications be?
Oh, the implications would be absolutely groundbreaking. It would mean rewriting our understanding of Earth's history, biology, and even the potential for advanced ancient civilizations.
Wow, imagine that. The history books would need a serious update. But speaking of history, you mentioned earlier that the source brings up the biblical flood as part of their theory. How does that factor into all of this?
Yeah, so the source suggests that the Earth before the flood was radically different, with conditions that could support these giant trees. They speculate that the flood was a catastrophic event that led to their destruction and the formation of the geological features we see today.
Okay, but the flood is a story from religious texts. Does mainstream science acknowledge any kind of global flood event in Earth's history?
While a global flood of the biblical scale is generally not accepted by the scientific community, there is evidence of significant flood events throughout history. For example, there's geological evidence suggesting a massive flood that filled the Black Sea basin thousands of years ago.
So large-scale floods have happened, just not necessarily on the biblical scale.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that while the flood narrative is significant in certain belief systems, we need to approach it from a scientific perspective when considering its potential impact on geological formations.
Right, that makes sense. So it sounds like there's a lot of ground to cover when discussing this theory. We've got the visual evidence, the scientific explanations, and even historical and religious narratives all intertwined.
It's a complex and multifaceted topic, for sure. And while the giant tree theory is a captivating concept, it's crucial to approach it with a critical eye, considering all the evidence and perspectives.
All right, so we've delved into both the giant tree theory and the mainstream scientific explanations. But before we wrap up, let's take a step back and think about the bigger picture here. What can we learn from exploring this theory, regardless of whether it turns out to be true or not?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways for me is just the importance of curiosity.
Yeah.
Even if this theory turns out to be way out there, the process of exploring it makes us question what we think we know about the world around us.
Yeah, I agree. And for me, what's really fascinating is how this theory challenges our perception of scale.
Scale. Okay, yeah.
Like, imagine standing at the base of a mountain, but instead of seeing just rock, you're seeing the remnants of something so massive that it just dwarfs our current understanding of life. It really shifts your perspective.
It does. It's like you're seeing the world through new eyes. Suddenly, these familiar hills and mountains, they take on a whole new meaning.
Exactly. And even if this specific theory doesn't hold up under scientific scrutiny, the journey of exploring it opens up all these possibilities.
Possibilities, like what well, it reminds us that there's still so much we don't know about our planet's history, and that there's always room for new discoveries.
That's a good point. It also underscores the importance of critical thinking, right?
Yeah.
We can't just accept every idea that comes along, no matter how intriguing it might seem.
Right. We have to evaluate the evidence, consider different perspectives, and be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Especially in a world where information is so readily available,
Yeah.
that ability to think critically is more important than ever.
I agree. It helps us, separate fact from fiction and engage in these meaningful conversations about complex topics.
Absolutely. So, for our listeners out there, the next time you find yourself looking up at a towering mountain or maybe walking through a vast desert, take a moment to really see it.
Yeah, just take it all in.
Ask yourself, what if there's more to this story than we've been told? What if those seemingly inert rocks hold secrets of a past beyond our wildest imagination?
It's a thought-provoking exercise for sure. And who knows, it might just spark your own deep dive into the mysteries of our world.
Exactly. And that's what we're all about here, embracing curiosity, asking questions, and never losing that sense of wonder about the world around us. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep looking up and keep asking questions.